Hey everybody, welcome. Um, I'm John Clancy, and you are my patrons, and I really appreciate it. Thank you so much. I am recording this upstairs from the Little Egypt Art Center in Mount Carmel, Illinois. And although it may look like a bombed out building in East Berlin, circa 1948, it's actually my study upstairs. Just quickly, those of you who've signed up, thank you again. And just to explain what this thing is, in case you don't know what you've signed up for, basically it's the old school patron model that artists relied on forever until quite recently. So you generously are supporting my work, not any individual play or essay or short story or whatever, but the work, and I really appreciate that. And give you a sense of what you're supporting right now. I am finishing the first draft of the second memoir. It's the follow-up to Happiness on the Hard Road, which is a memoir about how Nancy and I got from New York City to the Pennsylvania woods to a small town in southern Illinois, and how we kind of, got here and held on by our fingernails. And the second one, which is called A Practical Guide to Drowning, is the story of our first year and how we lived here and got this amazing art center that we now are operating. So there's that. A couple other things we're working on. We're starting up Little Pharaoh Press, which is going to be an online publishing outfit. Got a couple great authors lined up for that, and I'm going to be publishing my stuff. And what else is going on? Working on a new, or rather a rewrite of a play called Last Plot in Revenge by Brian Grace Duff, Philadelphia playwright. I directed it, created, worked on it and directed it about 5-6 years ago in Philadelphia. Phenomenal piece. It's a live action spaghetti western, and we serve spaghetti, so it's dinner theater, but it's also a live action old kind of spaghetti western with music and songs and fighting. It's incredible. Puppets. It's incredible. So that's what's going on. What I'm going to do for you tonight is I'm going to read you one of my stories. This is called It Wasn't Love. It's one of the pieces in the collection Ruined Beauty and Other Stories, which is available. So I'm just going to read you this story. It's just a short story. All the stories in Ruined Beauty are set in, or related to this town, Mount Carmel, which in the fictional universe is St. Lincoln. So this is all St. Lincoln, Illinois stories. And this one's called It Wasn't Love. Okay, here we go. Charlene was a whore, as no one had ever trained her to be anything else. She made enough whoring to keep just ahead of the bills, and some weeks even had a little extra left over. She dreamed some mornings in the bathtub about saving up enough to send her boy Flynn off to college like she'd heard rich people do. She'd soap herself and get lost in that dream, but when the water got cold, she woke up and knew Flynn would never see the inside of the college unless he was working a mop and probably on the graveyard shift. She was a small-town whore in St. Lincoln, Illinois, which was a little town in the southern part of the state, where the Wabash and the White meet up. Being the local whore had a good side and a bad side, like everything else out there. She didn't worry much about getting beat up and brutalized like the girls in Evansville or Memphis, but she had to carry her shame and sinfulness around town in front of everyone she'd ever known, and that was a burden some days. She mostly whored with people she knew, of course. Grade school friends and their brothers and uncles and fathers. Sometimes their sisters and aunts. Charlene didn't judge anyone. If they wanted her and had the money, then it was all right. Except for the occasional trucker or out-of-state stranger, she was always on a first-name basis with her customers. Hell, some of them were family. It wasn't a bad life as far as lives go. It wasn't good, but who deserves good, she'd think to herself on those mornings when it all seemed hopeless and the sky was dawning gray and cold. One Sunday or Tuesday afternoon, sitting at her post of the Panthers, Charlene heard a commotion starting up behind her. "You want a what?" Ed was running somebody down. "Just a mumble if you have a what?" Charlene heard the train and then a truck hissing and groaning down Ninth, so she didn't catch the stranger's reply. When the truck went away, Ed was still at it. He could stand behind the bar and run you down all day. It was like it was his real job and true vocation, outside of owning and operating the club. He couldn't pull it with anybody local, but God help the stranger who doped through the door looking for a drink. "What kind of scotch?" "If you have mumble that would..." "I can't serve you if I don't know what you want." Ed was just settling in, but Charlene heard the front glass door open and then swing shut fast with its bang, so whoever Ed was torturing must have given up and walked away. That was a good move in St. Lincoln. Just give up and walk down the road to the next disaster. Charlene didn't have that card to play, or if she did, she couldn't see it. No true customers showed up that afternoon, just Ed and Jaron, who worked the kitchen, so Charlene walked back home to rest up for the night shift. The police had taken her license away a year ago, and she hadn't yet found the money or time to set it right, but it didn't really hurt her. It was a small town. You could walk it, and so she did. Home was nice. She was always happy to see it and be inside. It was the only house she'd ever lived in, and though it was getting run down and needed paint and a new roof, it stood on live oak on 6 like it had since 1905, and that was a thing to be noted, if not respected. It was one of those old brick houses, built right, and it was hers. When her mother and father had both been taken by the tornado that hit the town back in '92, everything they had went to Charlene, and that was really just the house and the debts and her father's coin collection. The coins just about met the debts, and with her whoring, she made up the difference. She was 8 months pregnant with Flynn at the time, so her mind wasn't focused, but the lawyer, George Alka, was good to her, and everything worked out even. That was years ago. Flynn was 10 now, so it was 10 years and some months, she thought, opening the refrigerator door. There was nothing there to eat since she'd forgotten to shop last night coming home. She slept for a few hours on the sofa, with the flat screen on mute, watching the home improvement shows, Chip and Diane and those two brothers and all those. It was comforting, somehow, to watch rich people worrying about their new homes, and they all ended the same, so you didn't really have to pay attention. After dozing through 4 or 5 of them, she stood up, stiff, and went to the bathroom to get ready. She knew she wasn't what the world thought of as pretty or attractive, but she was young, and anyone could look good if you knew how to put on the eyeliner and lipstick, and she knew how to do all that. Dressing up was her favorite part about whoring. She would never understand why the other women in town, especially like the good-looking ones, like her best friend from when she was young, Susie Cook, hid their bodies with those sweaters and men's pants. Charlene was trying to match their natural gifts, and they were squandering a fortune, it seemed to her. She adjusted the whore uniform and judged herself in the mirror for a hard 5 seconds. All right. She walked over to Denny's 10-pin on 10th. The bowling alley was dead since it was summer, and nobody bowled for real until it got cold outside. Around sunset, she stepped outside and lit a Pall Mall Blue 100 and sucked in the smoke in the parking lot. The sun was going down over the by-low, and it was beautiful, unspeakably glorious, but she couldn't see it. She'd seen it too many times to see it fresh. It was just the real night coming in. A low black sports car sped by on 10th, and 2 minutes later came back the other way. It stopped in the road, signaling for a left turn into the parking lot. Charlene watched it through some smoke rings. It pulled up in front of her, and up close you could see it was old and banged up and dirty, but it was still a sweet ride. A Mustang or a Corvette or one of those. The passenger window slid down, and she leaned in, ready to go to work. In the dim interior, she could make out an oldish man with a bony face and a big nose. He didn't meet her eye, so she clocked him quick. Gray, crazy hair all over the top of his head, sticking out like it hadn't been brushed. Nice clothes, but rumpled. Looked tall, sitting down low in the sports car. Probably rich, judging from the car. Might be dangerous. "You looking for a date?" she said in the young, innocent voice she knew old men liked. "Maybe. Yeah. 200. Okay." She got in, and they drove over to the Four-Leaf Clover where he had a room. Driving out of town in silence, she was at first surprised he didn't try any kind of negotiations, and then just frightened. He was a big man, but didn't seem to be in shape, but a big man against a little whore was no contest. She thought about the $200 she'd maybe make. That was an out-of-towner rate, and her opening offer, and he had just said yes. He was either rich or he didn't have it. They pulled up into the gravel parking lot, and he killed the car and got out, and she saw his height, 6'4", maybe 5. Narrow shoulders and kind of sickly looking in the dying light. His tan suit was like his hair, like no one had paid attention to it in a while. He stepped around and opened her door fast and leaned down and held out an open hand. "Right this way, young lady." "Thank you, kind sir." He pulled her up out of the car, and she dropped his hand and did a little curtsy there in the parking lot, and he laughed. His laugh was crazy. It exploded out of him, high and frantic, and then was gone. And if you looked at his big, sad face, you doubted that you had heard it at all. Like a hyena barking, she thought. Not that she'd ever heard a hyena bark. Also his eyes. They were always everywhere except on you. Shifty eyes, shifting all over. Charlene stood in the common light and wondered if this had been a bad call. She knew Ty Waddle, who ran the Four-Leaf Clover, but he would be long since passed out drunk in the manager's office by now. It was past 8, and he took his first drink at noon most days. The Clover was the third best hotel in town for being clean, but it was isolated out there with no neighbors nearby, and sometimes a whore had to scream to stop a bully or a coward who starts getting rough, or worse. No one would hear her scream out here. The tall man was in room 111. He opened the door for her, and she stepped in. He locked it and stood with his back to her. She had pepper spray and a fish knife in her purse, and she slipped her hand in and fumbled for one or the other. He just stood there like he was lost or had forgotten what he was supposed to do next. Then he turned fast, spun around, and Charlene stepped back and her fingers found the knife. He smiled crazily, and it split his face, showing yellow teeth. "Drink?" "No, thank you." "Have a drink." He brushed by her into the bathroom. She should have run right there. She could walk back into town, even in her heels. She could make it. She stayed. The man was Asher Katz, a Jew from New York City who had recently been disgraced up in Chicago, at Chicago University, for sleeping with his students. One of them, a 19-year-old double major, had fallen in love with him. And when he explained to her that it wasn't love, just sex and youth and excitement, she turned venomous and went to her advisor and the head of the program and the newspapers. Asher went from tenure to unemployment in a day. A protege and ex-lover of his ran the department at Wabash Valley College and threw Asher a bone. He was now an adjunct without benefits or a guaranteed schedule, but he took it gratefully. He knew he had done wrong, but he couldn't help it. He liked young men and women, and they seemed to like him. Asher and Charlene fell into a routine. He'd pick her up in front of the bowling alley Sundays around noon, and they'd spend the day in the room. After 4 or 5 hours, he'd drive her back to wherever she wanted to get dropped off. She never asked him to take her home, as that was her own business. He didn't need to know where she lived. At the end of one Sunday, he asked if she was free the next day. She was always free, but she pretended to think about it. "After 3?" he asked. She unscrunched her face and nodded. So that was the new schedule. Sundays and Mondays, and sometimes a sleepover in the middle of the week. One morning, 5 months later, it hit Charlene that Asher was paying her enough that she didn't need any other customers. She was sitting in the bathtub at home, and as the water cooled around her, she felt something leave her, and leave her lighter, just lift right off of her. This must be what it feels like to graduate from something, she thought. A sense of having got through something hard and standing on the brink of something new. A year went by since Asher pulled up to her smoking there in front of the bowling alley. It wasn't love. It was companionship, she told herself. Just having a good time. Asher watched all the news shows and nonfiction TV, public access, and the other channels Charlene had never watched. When it was a show about money, or the economy, as they called money on the TV, Asher would get mad and shout at the people on the screen, calling them a goddamn pack of morons and liars. And there were always new books piled up around the room and on the desk. Asher read like he was studying for an exam every morning, and Charlene had always loved to read, ever since she had learned how. She thought of it as a way of getting lost in someone else's story and escaping your own. Charlene was an expert at escape. Sometimes they'd forget to have sex, and they'd forget to pay her. Neither of them noticed until they had left each other and were both alone. They never called each other by their names. He called her kid or dumb kid when she didn't understand something the second or third time. But he never said it harsh, more like he was shaking his head, knowing she could do better. She didn't call him anything. It wasn't that she was falling in love with this big, strange man. But he was the first thing she thought about when she woke, and the last thing she worried about when she closed her eyes to sleep. He was such a dope. For all his books and big words and education, he couldn't take care of himself. She knew she had to talk to him about it, or just make the change on her own. The next night, they were watching a documentary about Harry S. Truman, and she just said it. "I'm moving in here." He nodded, with his eyes still on the screen. Truman had just bombed Japan. "You heard me?" "Yeah." "All right." The next morning, he drove to her house, waited in the Jaguar while she put together a bag. When he was working at the college, Charlene would pore over the newspapers he'd pick up in Evansville and try to figure out what they were talking about. He got the New York Times and the Chicago Tribune and the Post-Dispatch from St. Louis, and also magazines that didn't have many pictures in them, just words and words. She'd lay splayed out on her stomach on the queen size for hours, reading until her eyes went dry, and when his key hit the lock, she'd look over at the clock and wonder how the day had just blipped by. Asher drank too much. He drank every night, and some mornings too. Charlene hadn't had a drink since they took Flynn away from her. The taste made her sad and miss her boy, and besides, it was bad for her body in the end. He gave her a ring one night. It was his grandmother's, he said, from back in Germany. She thanked him, slipped it on her left hand, red finger. It looked nice there, like it was where it was supposed to be. The next day, Asher Katz was killed in a freak meteorological event. Charlene had quit smoking and wouldn't allow it in the room, so he was standing outside the door in the crazy Illinois wind trying to light a cigarette. There's nothing between Canada and Illinois to stop the wind, so if it gets going, it just barrels through and can tear things up if it wants to. It was one of those fall days. He was flicking away at a cheap lighter, hunched over his Winston, and the wind was gusting and whooping and shrieking around him, blowing out the flame each time. An old abandoned feed store with a fallen roof stood an eighth of a mile down the road from the motel. The wind snatched a 4-foot slice of siding off of it and carried it west 90 feet in the air and then left it there hanging for a moment. Gravity finished the job. The aluminum siding dropped to the earth at 9.8 meters per second and just about cut Asher Katz in half, splitting his head into two separate pieces and cutting him right down just past the collarbone. The autopsy photos would become classics of the genre. He had just gotten his cigarette lit, too. Charlene heard the death and looked at the door. She put down the Harper's magazine she was rereading and waited for another sound. When none came, she got up and looked through the peephole but couldn't see anything, so she flipped the deadbolt and opened the door and saw Asher, or what was left of him. She looked around, didn't see anyone, so after a moment she stepped over, reached into his suit jacket's breast pocket and took out an old greasy envelope stuffed with large bills, hundreds and thousands bigger. She stepped back into the room and counted it up. 24,000. She called Kim's taxi and told him to pick her up to CVS. She paid him to drive her all the way up to Indianapolis and hold up in a motel downtown for a few days studying the financial shows that Asher would shout at back in St. Lincoln. One morning she walked over to the Goodwill and picked out some housewife-type clothes and a pair of flats. Dressed like a citizen, she walked into an Edward Jones down the street and got the young man behind the desk to start her up in investing. She did well at first, then she did better. Asher had been a good teacher, and plus, she had a knack. 9 years later, Charlene stood at the back of a crowd of graduating students. In their gowns and funny hats, surrounded in a sea of teachers and families, friends. It was a perfect, crisp June day in Ohio, and celebration and youth and achievement and all good things were in the air. You could breathe them in and out. She waited at the back with her eyes locked on one young man, tall and good-looking with beautiful brown eyes. She recognized with a small start that they were her eyes. Gathering herself, making sure she could breathe, she made her way carefully through the crowd until she stood before Flynn. She hadn't seen him in 17 years, but he looked just the same to her. Turns out everyone was wrong about Flynn, including herself. When they took him away because of her whoring and drowning in liquor and drugs, He had stayed with her aunt down in Florida for a few years, but then she got sick and couldn't care for him, so he bounced around between foster homes and different state agencies for most of his childhood. But Flynn was one of those rare good luck stories. A nice pastor and his wife got to talking with him on one of their outreach ministries at a grim and grimy boys' home in Owensboro, and they both felt the call. They had 8 children living with them already, some born from them and some not, so Flynn went from a year or two shy of being full-on feral to an instant, loud, loving Christian family. He took to school like a fish to water. He had always been smart, but now he had a reason to care. Charlene had tracked him down a few years back. She didn't want to mess up his new life, so she kept herself secret from him, but she kept regular tabs with an ex-cop who did that sort of thing for people with money. She'd learned that if you had money, you get people to do most anything. She looked up at her son, and he looked down at her, smiling. Congratulations. Thank you. Your mother must be very proud of you. Yes, I'm sure she is. He was such a good-looking, clean young man, and you could tell he'd been raised to have manners, as he didn't just dart away from this woman he didn't know. He looked at her and smiled again and asked her, "Did one of your children graduate today?" "Yes." She whispered, "Yes, he did." "Well, congratulations to you." "Thank you." And for some reason, the excitement of the day and the celebration all around him, or maybe somehow he knew, without knowing, but for some reason, he leaned down and hugged her hard and fast. She didn't even have time to hug him back. She was so surprised. It happened so quick, and then it was over. "I've got to go." "Sure," she said, stunned and reeling inside. It wasn't love. It was amazement. It was a wonder that something had worked out right, despite everything in its way. Flynn smiled again and melted back into his friends and family, all of them laughing and slapping at each other, thinking that the future was theirs for the taking and that it would be kind to them and that the road ahead would be easy. Charlene watched her boy disappear into the crowd and found herself smiling and shaking her head slowly. "Dumb kid," she said out loud, and turned away to get back to her life and her money. So that's It Wasn't Love, and that's part of the collection Ruined Beauty and Other Stories. So that's for you guys exclusively. Thanks for being the patrons. What's exciting is next week, next Thursday, one of our writers of Little Fair Press, Norman Thomas Marshall, he's going to be doing a 3-camera shoot telling one of his stories at a local cable station where he lives in Connecticut. So we're going to have that available. So that will be very cool. All right. Thanks, you guys. I'm going to try to turn this off, stop recording. And thanks again, and stay warm. Okay.